In other news, the International Legal Forum submitting rare legal claim to the International Criminal Court at The Hague. The claim calling for urgent investigation into Palestinian Authority President Abbas and Prime Minister Shatia for systematic and widespread torture. And this just a day before the UN Committee Against Torture set to convene in Geneva. Joining us to discuss this is attorney and CEO of the International Legal Forum, Arsen Ostrovsky. Thank you for joining us.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
So what exactly is in the claims against Palestinian Authority officials?
The claim is directed against specifically Mahmoud Abbas and also the Palestinian Prime Minister for the crime of torture, for the widespread, systematic and rampant acts of torture being carried out by the Palestinian Authority and the security services in the PA's name, both in the West Bank against Palestinian nationals, including women, children, human rights activists, critics, LGBTQ community, widespread, including beatings, including forced confessions, including violence, including even summary executions. But in addition to making a claim for torture against Palestinian nationals in the West Bank, we're also alleging that the Palestinian Authority is responsible for the torture and the condition of the 4 Israeli nationals that are being held captive by Hamas in Gaza as well.
Yeah, you included the arguments that the PA be held accountable for Hamas actions vis-a-vis the 4 Israelis being held captive in Gaza. Can you expand on this?
Sure, absolutely. When the Palestinian Authorities signed on to the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court, where we have made the submission for an investigation in these proceedings, they essentially agreed to jurisdiction extending over Gaza as well. In other words, the Palestinian Authority themselves have said that they are essentially liable for what emanates and what actions are committed, including in the West Bank and Gaza, meaning actions committed by Hamas, whether it's rockets, tunnels, are therefore potentially the responsibility and the legal responsibility, I should add, of the Palestinian Authority. So that extends to the ongoing captivity of the 2 Israeli soldiers, Oren Shul and Hadar Golden, as well as the 2 civilians, both of whom have mental health issues. So upon that basis, upon the PA themselves claiming to have jurisdiction over Gaza, we've said, well, if that is what you have claimed, then therefore you are also responsible for their condition as well.
What is the evidence that you've collected?
The evidence is it's all also open source as well. The Palestinians haven't really shied away from their actions. We have seen really indisputable evidence of various Palestinian security service officials acting under the instructions and directions of the PA, or in circumstances where they've acted and the PA has not done anything either, which makes them also criminally liable. And I should add specifically also one of the reasons for the timing is also in the wake of President Biden's visit to Israel, where at the end of the visit, he also, when visiting Mahmoud Abbas, he touted that the U.S. has essentially increased more or less $1 billion in funding Palestinians. So a question also now needs to be asked, certainly from an American perspective, what is this money going to? And are American tax dollars, for example, contributing to underwriting such acts of torture?
Unbelievable. The ICC and UN have a fairly extensive history of bias against Israel. So what outcome do you expect to get from this action?
At this stage, it's still very, very early. It's also, I should say, it's noteworthy that literally, I think, as we're speaking now, in the last 2 days in Geneva, in the UN offices in Geneva, the UN Committee Against Torture has, for the very first time, begun scrutinizing the Palestinian Authority over their record on torture and persons in their detentions. This is, Israel has never been short of scrutinization at the UN, but this is the first time that the Palestinian Authority is being investigated. And I should add, the other point that is noteworthy here is that the Palestinian delegation to these hearings is led by the current Palestinian Interior Minister. His previous role was as head of Palestinian Intelligence Security Services. This is literally the man that oversaw the entire Palestinian Authority infrastructure of torture. This is like sending, in many ways, Jack the Ripper as your chief defense counsel. So this is the man that is now making their case. And as we saw in the last 2 days, it's really been a predictable response by the Palestinians of basically saying, of excusing their actions, of defending their actions, and ultimately deflecting the situation, of course, predictably blaming Israel for all the ills. But we're certainly trying to shed a light on what the PA is doing, specifically President Abbas and the Prime Minister, over these widespread, rampant and relentless systematic torture that have been carried out really for over a decade under their name.
Yeah, and we know of so many human rights violations by the Palestinian Authority, and it seems as if the world simply doesn't care. Arsen Ostrovsky, thank you so much for this interview.
Thank you for having me.